We are, yeah, back to recording. Excellent. Um, okay, so we covered why research and science are important. We covered research attitudes and identities. And now I just want to say a little bit about thinking like a scientist. And we'll get into this a little bit more in our second lecture as well. Um, but a lot of the kind of feedback that I hear from students, previous Neropa students on kind of the first day of class, when they think about research, they oftentimes have these views that research can be very biased. And first, to offer a name, research often can have a very colonial perspective. And there's a growing movement, at least prior to the Trump administration, there's a growing movement, especially in psychology research, to recognize that. So we call that movement decolonial psychology, which really seeks to evaluate our own biases. And the research looks at kind of the research that we have, what biases are implicit in that, right? So I want to offer that there is this kind of growing movement. And that kind of streamlines into how I think of research as a whole, as a thing that is really quite fluid. Um, when I was in graduate school and I was kind of doing my research on stress hormones, this kind of final aim of my dissertation research explored stress receptors in the brain and the way that stress receptor expression and function gets altered in the brain. And I had these findings that were very puzzling. Usually we think of there being two different types of stress hormone receptors. They're called glucocorticoid receptors, GRs, and mineralocorticoid receptors, MRs. And these receptors are thought to be able to be located either on the membranes of the cells, where they're thought to have very rapid non-genomic actions. And if you don't know what that means, no problem, we'll get into that. Or they can be located in the cytosol, so like in the middle of the cell, where they're thought to, once a receptor binds to them, they're thought to travel to the nucleus and act on DNA to have these genetic impacts. When I kind of looked at how the receptors might get altered in amphetamine withdrawal as a possible explanation for why stress has this very differential effect in amphetamine withdrawal on dopamine output, what I found was that both receptors seem to be involved in glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids in this process, and they seem to be located in the cell. When we blocked the ability of cortisol to enter into the cell, that blocked the actions that we saw on a coupled dopamine output, but they were rapid and non-genomic, like membrane-bound receptors. And when we blocked one of the two receptors, whichever one we blocked, that blocked the action. So what that suggested, I scratched my brain around this so much, and the only thing that I could think of was there must be, more than two types of receptors. There must be, at least a third type of receptor where these two receptors are coming together as one. And they're in the cytosol, but they're also non-genomic. I didn't know of, that was not something that was commonly known. I scoured the literature, and I think I maybe only found two other publications that suggested anything like that or had seen anything like that. So my advisor at the time, brilliant, brilliant woman, I was able to, she kind of suggested I was able to go to some international conferences, particularly a conference in Turin, Italy, on neurohormones, where I was able to meet like some of my research heroes, just the biggest names in research, folks who are credited with discovering stress hormone receptors in the brain. And one in particular, Dr. Herman, I went up and kind of everyone who I was engaging with, I was like sharing my data and going like, this is what we're finding. This is the only thing that I can think of. Like, what do you think? And they would all kind of say like, yeah, that makes the most sense, And so this Dr. Herman, who was involved in discovering hormone receptors in the brain, when I shared this with him, he said, yeah, well, when he was European, so he had kind of an accent. When we found stress hormone receptors in the brain, we were like, I can't remember exactly how I said it, we were just looking in the brain and we were like, whoa, what is this this like substance that we're finding in the brain, this looks like cortisol. And then we tested it and we found out, oh, it is cortisol. And then we were like, well, what are these receptors in the brain? These look like, hormone receptors. And then we kind of tested them and we were like, oh, there are hormone receptors. So then we were like, oh, I guess that, there are hormone receptors in the brain and, and hormones can get in the brain. Prior to that, we thought that hormones were just isolated to the body. Um, and the way that he shared that with me, because he was someone who I deeply, deeply admired, and he was just a real person like the rest of us, it really helped me have a view on research as a very fluid, humble process. What we really do in research, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, when we're publishing research findings, we're not saying, this is true, and I know this is true, and this will be true for the rest of time. I don't know any researchers who think that about their own research. None. What we're saying is, I made this observation. I was kind of curious about it. So this was a way I thought I could like test it. And so I did that test, and here's what I found. And here's what I kind of make of these findings based on what we know now, you know? And so it's really like the conclusions that we make in science are really just like, this is what this is what I think. And that's why we've got this whole, discussion section in our publications. And I'm jumping the gun. We'll get into this in our next lecture. But I just want to really impress that piece of humility in science and research, I think, is so, so important. And let me give a little pause here. Oops, that wasn't what I meant to do. Okay, so we'll get into this a little bit more in the next lecture, but when we start opening up, getting into, when we start talking about, sorry, maybe I'll edit this out if we can. We'll see if that's possible. When we talk about the scientific method, this is a textbook that I use for my research and program evaluation students in the clinical mental health counseling master's program. And chapter 4 of this textbook talks about the scientific method right down here. And so if we zoom in, right down here, A Tale of Two Sciences, Research and Program Evaluation, the scientific method as a fundamental research process. And it gives us a little outline of that process. So the first step is we make an observation. I think we as humans, we're naturally curious individuals. So as we go about our daily lives, we might make observations and we might kind of start to recognize patterns or think that we recognize patterns, or we might, be curious about why something might be the way it is. And so we might then ask a question. Yeah, so we might then ask a question. Is this, does X occur because of Y? Do these things always occur together? Does this predict this, right? So we're curious, we ask questions. And then in research, the first thing we do when we ask those questions is we go to the literature. And we'll get into this a little bit more in another lecture. So we go to the literature and we ask, like, what does the literature show? Has someone else already asked this question, right? I think that it can be arrogant to suppose that we can, know everything in our own brains. And especially in this day and age, like, we've got so many years of research developed. So the first thing we do is we go to the literature and we ask, has anyone else asked this question before? Has anyone else asked questions like this before? What is known already in this area and what's not known? So we review the literature and then we develop a hypothesis, a research question. Either the question's been asked already, and we look at the findings and we go, oh, yeah, okay, they found that makes sense. Or we go, oh, they found that, but I don't really, I think they missed this part, or I don't know, this part of their methodology. I don't really think that, whatever it is. So we develop our own hypothesis that is informed by the literature. And then we identify a way to test the hypothesis, right? Okay, I think this, how could I test that? So that's where we kind of conduct our research. We test the hypothesis, and then we look at our findings and we analyze the data, we see what we found, and we make conclusions, and so this is where we kind of say, well, here's what I found. And usually at this point, we actually go back to the literature, has anyone else found this, especially if we get findings that we don't anticipate. We go back to the literature, so we say, okay, here's what I found. Has anyone else ever found this? Yes, they have. Okay, here's what they thought. No, they haven't. Okay. And then we make our own conclusion. Here's what I think about the research. And then again, we go back to the literature. Is what I think, is that supported? Has anyone else, suggested or found anything like this? So again, we go back to the literature. Um, then, we kind of draw our conclusions. Either our results, our findings confirm our initial hypothesis, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, in research, that's actually a brilliant and beautiful thing. Most research discoveries actually happen when our results don't, they don't confirm our hypothesis. So there's this quote, the most important saying in research is not "I've got it" or "Eureka." It's "Huh, that's weird," because that's where we really start to advance our knowing, our knowledge. And that's where we really innovate a field, or how we can think of a field. So we make these conclusions, and then we go back to our initial hypothesis. We look for whether they align or not, and then we communicate our results. So we present our results at conferences, we talk to other researchers or clinicians, and then ultimately we might publish our findings. And again, when we're doing that, we'll get into this in our next lecture as well. There's a very structured way that we tend to publish research findings in research. We start with an introduction or a background, then we talk about our, which is kind of, if we're looking at the slide up here, kind of describes the observation, helps it make sense why we arrived at this question, talks about where the literature is. That's the intro background section. Then we have this method section. We talk about what we did to test our hypothesis. Then we have a results section. We talk about what we found. We don't talk about what we think about it. We just say what we found. And then we have the discussion section. And the discussion section is, for most researchers, including myself, like that's really where we get to kind of be creative and use our brains and use our thinking. To me, that's where research can really be like an art form, and we get to kind of like paint our own Mona Lisas, and say, this is what I asked, this is what I did, this is what I found, here's what I think. And when we do that in research, we never do that in the silo, right? So we say, like, here's kind of what I think, and this has been supported in the research, or this hasn't been supported in the research, but we really relate it back to the literature base as a whole. And that really helps us have humility and grounding, right? No researcher does their research on their own. It's a full team effort that also involves all research that's already been done. So it's kind of like this collective, it's advancement of collective knowing or thinking. So we communicate the results. And then usually that leads back to another observation, right? If our hypothesis is not supported, then that'll usually lead to another question. And if it is supported, that'll usually lead to another question. So we just kind of keep going, right? And all of that we do with a lot of humility. Usually when we interpret our findings, what we're really saying is, like, here's what I think based on what is known now, based on the information that I have available to me right now. Here's what I make of these findings. We're not saying this is the absolute truth, right? So I think that's really important to kind of preface for any science or research class, right? That that most research is offered in a spirit of humility. And I think that it can be important that when we read literature and research, we interpret it as such. We understand that these are people, offering their best guesses. And I think that can help on the student side, I think, and on the recipient side, that can help us have more grace with what we're reading. And it can also make it more inviting, right? Like, anyone in this class can be a researcher if you would like to. Oh, I had this slide. I was going to talk about some of my own research, but I think I'll skip that. Yeah, shucks. Okay. So I think that's the intro. We're at about an hour. That was a pretty long intro lecture. Thanks for hanging with me. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'm very excited to be teaching this class. I hope that you will kind of, put a little bit of information about your own self and your own research identity in the discussion section. Yeah, really looking forward to this class. Thank you.